Dear guests, we are glad to welcome you at the 5th seminar of our series, Historians and the War, Rethinking the Future. I will start with a short technical announcement. The seminar today lasts for 1.5 hours, and in the second part, we will have a question and answer section where questions from the audience can be discussed. So please write your questions into the chat. The event is recorded and it will later be published on the YouTube channel of the German-Ukrainian Historians Commission. You will also find the link on the websites of the partner institutions. The language of the event today is English with simultaneous translation into Ukrainian. To listen to the translation, please click on the icon with the globe in the right bottom of your screen in Zoom. And now I would like to ask Jaroslav Krycak to say a few words about our seminar series.
Thank you so much, dear Lena. Friends and colleagues, welcome to the 5th seminar. Дорогі друзі, вітаю вас. Запрошую вас на участь в нашому 5-му семінарі. This seminar has been conceived a long time ago. It's basically a response to Russian aggression against Ukraine, and this war. It gives us a force to rethink the 20th century empires and nation states, regimes and ideologies, remember civil war and mass crimes. And looking forward, we're putting the question of how should we understand our history from the vantage point of today, and what will become of it tomorrow. So this is exactly the question that we address our seminar. And for this purpose, we formed this joint initiative, Historians and the War, Rethinking the Future. We have 5 partners who united their resources and efforts for this to seek the same. And this is the German-Ukrainian Historians Commission, which is represented by co-chairs by Professor Dr. Martin Schulze-Wessel from Munich and Professor Dr. Jaroslav Krycak, who is me. Then we have a Department of European History in Munich University, represented by Professor Dr. Martin Schulze-Wessel again. Ukrainian Catholic University, again me, and Ukraine-based scholarly journal Ukraina Moderna. It's represented by Institute of Editor-of-Chief of the journal Ukraina Moderna, Galicia. And finally, the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, represented by Natalia Hanenko-Friesen and Dr. Frank Sysyn. This is our 5th seminar, and it's titled History and the War, discussion with Professor Wolff. It is being held in English with simultaneous translation, as Lena says, and without further ado, I would pass my word to moderator of our seminar, Professor Frank Sysyn from University of Alberta. Welcome, Frank.
Thank you very much. So it is my immense pleasure and honor today to introduce Professor Larry Wolff. Professor Wolff studied at Harvard and Stanford universities. He is the Silver Professor of History at New York University. And until recently, he was the executive director of the Remark Institute at New York University. I think that's of special interest to us today when we think of All Quiet on the Western Front and the impact of Remark's work. He now is a co-director of the New York University Institute in Florence. He has received many, many honors, including being a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the recipient of a Guggenheim Foundation Fellowship. His interests are immense, as well as his knowledge of fields far away from what might directly be called Eastern European history, above all because of his special interests in Italy and Italian works. And he is drawn as well to the art form of opera in his discussions of the past. For those of you who may not have looked through all of his many books and publications, I much recommend you turn to The Singing Turk, Ottoman Power and Operatic Emotions on the European Stage, from the Siege of Vienna to the Age of Napoleon. I think more of you will know his works on the idea of Galicia, history and fantasy and Habsburg political culture, his works on Venice and the Slavs, the discovery of Dalmatia in the Age of the Enlightenment, his Inventing Eastern Europe, the map of civilization on the mind of the Enlightenment, and his numerous works on the Uniate Church, and the Vatican, including the Vatican and Poland in the age of partitions, diplomatic and cultural encounters in the Warsaw Nunciature. He has agreed to begin our discussion today with his newest publication, one that comes, I think, closer to many of the topics we are facing at the moment. That is the impact of war, the changes that wars bring about, and what this has meant for Eastern Europe. So I would ask him to first present his PowerPoint presentation on Woodrow Wilson and the Reimagining of Eastern Europe before we begin our question and answer session. Please, Larry Wolff.
Thanks very much, Frank. You should have mentioned in the introduction what would have been, for me, the most important thing to mention, which is that you were my professor when I was an undergraduate student, and my education as a scholar of Eastern Europe began with you some decades ago. We can hardly count them. When I was a student, and you taught me about Eastern Europe in the class that you were offering at Harvard. I think it must have been 1977 or 1978. So it's a particular pleasure and honor for me to get to have this conversation with you today. Thank you also to Jaroslav Fritzak, whose work I so much admire, and I'm very, very happy to be part of this whole program with both of you. I'm going to share my screen now and speak as briefly as I can about Woodrow Wilson in Eastern Europe, and suggest some of the ways in which we might think about the history in relation to the tragic current war of Russian aggression in Ukraine. Can you see, can somebody nod if you can just tell me that you can see my screen? Yes, excellent. Okay, so I was interested in Wilson and the ways in which he transformed or was involved in the transformation of the map of Eastern Europe following World War I. And one of the subjects that's interesting to think about is the ways in which wars shape people's sense of nationhood, nationality, and the ways in which they become opportunities, both for good and for bad, for the reshaping of the map. You'll notice that the post-war map that Wilson helps to create is not one, I've shown it to you on the right, that clearly includes an independent Ukraine, which here is incorporated into already into the Soviet Union on this map that shows you 1919. For me, the project on Wilson and the Reimagining of Eastern Europe was meant to be a little bit of a 20th century follow through on the work that I did connected to the 18th century on what I called the invention of Eastern Europe. And if I were going to think a little bit about the invention of Eastern Europe in relation to Ukraine, I would want to emphasize the ways in which the 18th century both put Eastern Europe on the map and paid attention to Ukraine. I'm here thinking about what was for me a very important work. I wrote about this for the first time in Harvard Ukrainian Studies many years ago in an article that was meant to honor Professor Pritzak. And Voltaire, writing in the 18th century about the history of Charles XII, had to focus on Poltava in 1709 and the Great Northern War, and paid attention to Ukraine when he described the military advances of the Swedish King Charles XII. Charles sent orders to bring his troops and provisions with all haste to Ukraine. Charles, and he characterized Ukraine as ce pays perdu, these lost lands, as un pays inconnu. And one of the points of history writing for Voltaire was to discover a lost land, and in a certain sense to put Ukraine on a map of Europe for his readers, specifically a map of Eastern Europe. He marched to the south toward Ukraine, the land of the Cossacks, located between Tartary, Poland, and Muscovy, northern part of Ukraine, cultivated and rich, and so on. I'm going to be relatively brief here, but what I want to emphasize here is that the 18th century was interested in locating Ukraine on a map in relation to the Battle of Poltava, which Voltaire understood to be part of continental Europe, experiencing the same winter of 1709 that as we experienced it in France. And Voltaire also understood Ukraine to be a land that has always aspired to freedom, but being hedged in by Russia, the dominions of the Grand Seigneur, Turkey, and Poland, has been obliged to seek for a protector, and goes on to remark that the Ukrainians appealed to the Russians, who did their best to reduce them to serfdom. When I think about the 20th century, one of the things that interests me is the ways in which Wilson did and did not try to put Ukraine on a contemporary map of the early 20th century. And for me, the whole discussion about Eastern Europe is interesting for the ways in which it tries to locate the different component parts of the European continent on the map. And if I were thinking about a project like this one in relation to the current war, the first thing that I would say about it, and we can talk about this later, is that for sure it has put Ukraine on maps for different publics all around the world, perhaps more emphatically and more clearly, though tragically, in ways that are very different and more decisive, I think, than Ukraine has marked people's mental consciousness over the course of past decades and perhaps even past centuries. For Wilson, I would want to say that Ukraine lies very far right below the surface of his reflections on Eastern Europe. It's something he comes to very late, and I would say understands pretty poorly, although once he begins to think about it, his thoughts about it are fairly interesting. If you look at what he has to say here, you can see that when he's thinking about the war, he in the early stages, January 1917, there are different pieces that interest him of the map: Poland, Belgium, Serbia, Alsace and Lorraine. And for Wilson, the whole understanding of the war is about trying to think about different component parts of Europe. And Eastern Europe, which I would say Wilson probably did not think about for 10 minutes until World War I, played almost no role in his mental perspective on the world. And we should understand him as someone who really has to give himself a crash course in understanding the eastern part of Europe prior to playing such a large role in its transformation following the war at the peace conference. In his 14 points, he mentions the peoples of Austria-Hungary, whose place among the nations we wish to see safeguarded assured should be accorded the freest opportunity of autonomous development. That would clearly include the Ukrainians of Eastern Galicia, though Wilson at that point in January 1918 probably could not have named the various peoples of Austria-Hungary who were implicated in point 10 of his famous 14 points. Point 13 was perhaps most crucial for thinking about the future map, but also for thinking about Ukraine. His point that an independent Polish state should be erected which should include the territories inhabited by indisputably Polish populations. And that would be a very difficult point in the discussions of the peace conference, and one that would inevitably come to include discussions of Ukrainian populations who were eventually incorporated into the post-war Polish state. Speaking in Krakow in December 1918, the Polish geographer Eugeniusz Romer focused in on this, the word indisputably, niewątpliwie, in Polish, and wondering what is meant by this weighty word in the New World Order. And it would be discussed at length in the peace conference. We associate Wilson closely with the idea of national self-determination, which is certainly relevant for thinking about the early 21st century, the current war, the current crisis. For Wilson, self-determination is not a mere phrase, it's an imperative principle of action. Yeah, actually, self-determination is put in quotation marks in the text of his speech. I'll talk about that in a moment. He says, all well-defined national inspiration shall be accorded the utmost satisfaction without introducing new or perpetuating old elements of discord. That'll become to be a very problematic principle for Wilson, as he realizes that it's only very gradually and slowly that it's difficult to satisfy people's national aspirations to the utmost without creating new antagonisms. He puts self-determination in quotes. I've always wondered whether it's meant to reference the fact that the person who uses the phrase first is Lenin, and we should see this as being a little bit of a rivalry in which Lenin and Wilson are both using the phrase, understanding that it's inimical to the great empires as they exist during the course of the war. And they'll both be using the phrase both, we can say ideologically and politically when they think about the geopolitical map of Europe following the war. For Wilson, it's a war of emancipation from pretty early on, an emancipation from the attempted mastery of selfish groups of autocratic rulers becomes for him a war of emancipation for peoples of Eastern Europe seeking to be free. I'd want to emphasize that emancipation has a very powerful currency in American rhetoric, closely associated with Abraham Lincoln and the Civil War. And the Lincoln Memorial was actually being built during the Wilson presidency in Washington. So Wilson would have been very aware of it. For Wilson, speaking about the treaty in 1919, its principle is that enslaved peoples ought to be freed. It's a language that looks back to the language of Voltaire in the 18th century and looks forward very, very influentially to the Cold War, when we can see Ronald Reagan in 1964, still in the early Cold War, speaking of 1 billion human beings now enslaved behind the Iron Curtain. The idea of peoples enslaved in Eastern Europe is something that Wilson uses both rhetorically and meaningfully and ideologically, and one that will greatly shape American thinking and rhetoric over the course of the later 20th century. Wilson is vastly celebrated in Paris, but when he tries to present the work that he's doing in Paris to Americans back home, and Americans ultimately do not approve the Treaty of Versailles. America rejects the treaty as negotiated by Wilson. Wilson feels that his job is to do something like what Voltaire was doing in the 18th century, show people where Eastern Europe is, right? Create a map. We're carving a piece of Poland out of Germany's side. We're creating an independent Bohemia below that, independent Hungary below that, enlarging Romania, rearranging territorial division of the Balkan states. He's actually drawing a map for his public, talking to them about places that are going to be very unfamiliar to the most members of the Democratic National Committee at the White House luncheon, let alone the peoples he was speaking to in San Diego in the group that I showed you, in the quotation that I showed you before. Here for Wilson, Eastern Europe is a map of interchangeable parts that need to be puzzled together in order to form a new post-war map. Here's a contemporary map that shows some of the puzzle pieces, including Ukraine, including Galicia. And one of Wilson's mental problems is actually a puzzle problem. How do you take these pieces and arrange them into nationally sovereign states in a meaningful and stable way? So as with Voltaire, trying to locate countries on the map in relation to other countries. Wilson repeatedly, here in Iowa, south of Bohemia is Poland, which we cut away from the Austrian combination. Below Bohemia is Hungary, which can no longer rely upon the assistance strength of Austria. A repeated attempt to put countries in alignment. Ukraine, at the end of June, Wilson was asked at a press conference, what about Ruthenia? To which he replied, something is being done about Ruthenia, but I am ashamed to say I don't remember what. It's a little bit of a blind spot for Wilson, who gives himself a crash course of education in Eastern Europe. And I think it would be reasonable to say that Ukraine is just beyond the level of where he feels like he has acquired a competent knowledge of the lands and peoples of Eastern Europe, looking towards the peace conference. Of course, there are very important people like Hrushevsky, editing L'Europe Orientale, who has a clear vision of Eastern Europe that does include Ukraine in 1919. And I don't know whether this is something that would be interesting to talk about later, Frank, but I think that Hrushevsky and Wilson are very interesting as parallel figures at this moment, as academics in politics, for whom academic thinking is very important in shaping their rather different maps of what post-war Eastern Europe should look like. For Wilson, the academic side of his project is pursued by a group that he assembles called the Inquiry. It's put together by Colonel House, the guy who stands behind the couch right there, is run by the president of City College in New York, Sidney Mezis, and they're the ones who are responsible for putting together information about Europe as a whole, and perhaps especially Eastern Europe, where Wilson knows so little. A large number of them sail with him on the USS George Washington when he goes to Europe in December of 1918, and he's supposed to have exclaimed on the ship, 3 million Germans in Bohemia, Masaryk never told me that. And it's a reminder of the ways in which the settlement of the Versailles Treaty was a very complicated one based on information, misinformation, and a complex understanding of nationality, a subject in which Wilson was really a beginner when he was still on the boat coming to Europe in 1918. At the same time, the Inquiry did give him valuable information, not only about the Germans in Bohemia, but they told him that, this is the young Walter Lippmann writing this memorandum, Western Galicia is clearly Polish, Eastern Galicia is in large measure Ukrainian or Ruthenian and does not of right belong to Poland. There were people who were on Wilson's boat, on Wilson's staff, who were telling him this from early on, from October 1918. Before the end of the war. Wilson, however, in addition to receiving information from his good friend Tomasz Masaryk, was also receiving information from the man he thought of as his good friend Ignacy Jan Paderewski, the famous pianist and Polish statesman, who referred to him as the foster father of our chiefless land, Poland's inspired protector. For many a month, the spelling of your name has been the only comfort and joy of a starving nation, wrote Paderewski to Wilson in 1917. And Paderewski has very clear, or perhaps we should say, purposefully confusing ideas about Ukraine, which he feeds to Wilson. There is some misunderstanding concerning Ukraina and Galicia. There are two Ukrainias and there is only one Galicia. The people in Galicia pretend to be Ukrainians on account of the similarity of their language with the real Ukrainian people. These people are not Ukrainians. Almost a purposeful obfuscation. Lloyd George asks, does Poland claim the whole of Galicia? And Paderewski says, we have given autonomy to this country. We claim the whole of Galicia. We claim it for the simple reason that it is absolutely impossible to define ethnographically this country. So the possibilities and the impossibilities of ethnographic definition are something that's already rhetorically in play in June 1919, and perhaps interesting to think about in relation to the 21st century as well. The complicated set of claims, true and false, about ethnography, which shape perceptions of the region. Within Poland, or the new Polish state. You can see for czas, right, the Ukrainian circumstances are summed up as anarchia ukraińska, right? Ukrainian anarchy. Again, a kind of purposeful obfuscation. Very important for me to show you czas because I wrote my senior thesis when I was a senior in college some 40-something years ago, advised by Frank Sysyn, using czas as the principal source. There's me some 40 years ago when I was a college senior reading czas under Frank's guidance. The person on the inquiry who was most responsible for Eastern Europe was Archibald Cary Coolidge, professor of history at Harvard in the early 20th century, the director of the Harvard University Library, very responsible for, I want to go back to, very responsible for the creation of the Harvard Slavic collection in the library, and therefore indirectly responsible, we'd have to say, for the creation of the Harvard Slavic department, and eventually the Harvard Ukrainian Institute, created some 50 years after Coolidge's death. Coolidge, quite aware of Ukraine, says, I've made no close study of the question of Galicia in general. I should favor as a boundary between Poland and Ukraine, something like the line of the Bug and the Stry, or the temporary demarcation fixed by the International Commission recently in Lemberg and rejected by the Ukrainians. Likewise for Bukovina, he recognizes that there is a Ukrainian population there, is interested in informing Wilson about this, although again, it's detail that goes beyond what Wilson feels that he has the bandwidth for at that moment. I want to emphasize about Coolidge that his students, Kerner on the left, Lord on the right, they're his graduate students. They're with him in Europe in 1919. They play a role at the peace conference. A lot of knowledge about Eastern Europe is brought to play in the peace conference, but a great deal of knowledge is also taken out of the peace conference process by the studies that are made here. We would say for sure that Coolidge is the founder of the field of Eastern European history in the United States. His student Kerner below went to Berkeley, where he was a professor of East European history. His student Vucinic went to Stanford, where he was a professor of East European history, and Vucinic was my professor at Stanford in the 1980s. So within 4 academic generations, you could trace out a large part of the American academic study of Eastern Europe, dating back to the peace conference and the people who were advising Wilson about Eastern Europe. Lord, in particular, on the right, was the Polish expert. The Poles referred to him as Nasz Lord, a pun on, Paternoster, right? And because he was so much of a Polonophile as they understood him. The people who Lord was working with were traveling through Eastern Galicia, meeting with Ruthenians and Jewish representatives on the newly elected town councils, and reporting that the Ukrainian peasants were now peacefully tilling their fields and bore no hostile feelings toward the Poles, and expressed themselves glad that they have come to establish order again. Something that was surely a gross distortion of sentiment on the ground in Eastern Galicia in the early 20th century. Lieutenant Foster reporting to Lord, reporting to Coolidge, reporting to Wilson, says it's hard to understand after what I've seen in these last few days, how much faith can be put in the ability of these Ruthenian peoples to govern themselves. Paderewski, you must find it natural that we try to protect people of our own speech and our own blood if they are attacked, if they are murdered, if they are slaughtered by Ukrainians and by these people under the Bolshevist regime. Lloyd George replies, they are making the same accusations against your troops. I only saw a Ukrainian once. The only Ukrainian I have ever seen in the flesh was upstairs. I haven't seen another. It is the last Ukrainian I have seen, and I'm not sure that I want to see any more. That is all I know about it. So again, perhaps a question of bandwidth for the peacemakers at this moment, an acknowledgement of their own lack of engagement with Ukraine, and an unwillingness to become more engaged with Ukraine at that moment. Though for Wilson, who remarks that it seems that our disagreeable friends, the Poles, raise a new difficulty about the truce which they must conclude with the Ukrainians, he understands that Polish-American friendship, suggested in that image below is complicated by the Ukrainians of Eastern Galicia. It's American Jews who appeal to Wilson on behalf of all minority groups of Eastern Europe, paying attention to atrocities which the Jews of Poland and Galicia have recently been subjected, even at the moment while the peace conference is engaged in bestowing sovereign powers and extensive territories upon Poland. And of course, minority rights will be the flip side of national self-determination, which Wilson will only barely discover at the peace conference before he returns following the signing of the Treaty of Versailles. So Wilson's transformations of the map across the war, or the transformations to which he contributes, produces a new map of national states in Eastern Europe, and it's totally trashed in 1939, 1940 by Hitler and Stalin, Molotov-Ribbentrop being perhaps the first signal of the trashing of the Wilsonian map of Eastern Europe. And it's often done in the name of nationality. That is to say, Stalin speaking in the name of nationality when he unites Western Ukraine with Eastern Ukraine. Hitler speaking in the name of nationality when he reclaims the 3 million Germans of Czechoslovakia. It's interesting to look at this very cynical moment in which Wilsonian ideas about nationality are being rhetorically deployed in order to destroy the Wilsonian map of Eastern Europe. It's Hitler and Stalin who take down Wilson's statues all over Eastern Europe. First Hitler and then Stalin keeps them down. He is no hero for Hitler and Stalin. One of the things, the moments, and I don't have time to talk about it, that's kind of interesting is Hitler playing Wilson with respect to Transylvania in 1940 in renegotiating the division of Transylvania between Hungary and Romania, in theory on the grounds of the ethnic map of Transylvania. Look magazine in 1939 believed that for this reason, the next European war will start in the Ukraine. An interesting moment to look back on now from the perspective of the early 20th century. Last thing I want to say is that if we look at the map created following the Cold War, the map that has Ukraine on it as an independent country, as well as the Baltic states, Moldova, all independent states, right, in the post-Cold War settlement. One of the things we might ask about it is it a Wilsonian map or not? It's the moment at which Wilson statues are being re-erected in different parts of Eastern Europe. The statue in Prague goes up again in the early 21st century. The post-Cold War settlement sees the destruction of the two signature Wilson creations, which are Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia. He deeply believes in both of those states, and they are both fragmented following the end of the Cold War. But I think we would have to argue that this map is very much based on the Wilsonian principles of national self-determination, the post-Cold War map, and in some sense, the completion of work that Wilson undertook, or Wilson deeply believed in at Versailles in 1919. And that part of what we are looking at now is the destruction of and undermining of that Wilsonian map that emerges in the post-Cold War moment. Let me stop there.
Thank you very much. A book that covers so many topics, and I think will engender many questions from our audience. I remind those that are listening to please put questions into chat. But I will take on the, in this case, the prerogative of an elderly professor who started off with chats with you, and maybe try and go back in time to something that I think would be worthwhile to see how you come to this topic. You studied at Harvard at a point when there was a Ukrainian Institute. Most of the field is just now finding Ukraine, including historians, but particularly a general public. And what I wonder is, if you look back at it now, what drew you to Eastern Europe, and what role did this Ukrainian studies that was at Harvard play? Has it influenced you in the long term in career in any way that you can see directly in your understanding?
Oh, so Frank, I mean, that's a great question. And I'm not sure I could even outline all the ways in which it's influenced me, because it was really very decisively formative for me. There was a Ukrainian Institute at Harvard when I was an undergraduate student, but I was very aware that it was a brand new Ukrainian Institute at the time that I was an undergraduate at Harvard. And it was interesting partly for that reason that it was a brand new academic venture that was in the process of, establishing itself. I can remember Professor Pritzak's inaugural lecture as the Rushevsky Professor of Ukrainian History at Harvard. I was drawn to Eastern Europe, I would say probably by the Cold War moment that we were all living through. I'm very much a child of the Cold War, born in 1957. And I came to Harvard and actually studied Polish language as a sophomore with Professor Weintraub, whom you also remember, and who played a part in the creation of the Ukrainian Institute as well. But one of the things that was actually interestingly true about Harvard at that moment is that if you were interested in East European history, as I was, there wasn't actually a different way to study Eastern Europe at that moment. You almost had to go through the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute. The courses that were being offered on Eastern Europe were being offered out of that institute. And the people who are at the, on this, webinar with us mostly know this story, but there's a moment in the summer of 1975 when I go to 1583 Mass Ave. I'm 18 years old, almost 19, and knock on the door because that's the address for where the course on Eastern Europe supposedly is going to originate. I knock on the door, and it's summertime, there's nobody there. Professor Pritzak answers the door and invites me in. And that's really the beginning of my serious study of Eastern Europe. If you ask me about long-term effect on my academic career, I would say that it was very important to me for beginning to understand the complex relationship between nationality and national culture on the one hand, and the geopolitical map on the other hand, the ways in which they do not always correspond. And the ways in which national thinking would seek to try to shape or transform the geopolitical map, beginning with shaping and transforming the way we think about the geopolitical map. In the presentation that I just made, it should be super clear, but one of the most important strands of my whole academic life is trying to understand how intellectuals and thinkers regard the geopolitical map, where their ideas come from, the ways in which professors shape that map or shape thinking about that map. A lot of that begins for me at 1583 Mass Ave at the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute, which is so clearly an academic and scholarly endeavor, which is aimed at helping us to think in complicated ways about the map of Europe.
I see colleagues are interested in asking questions as well. I will just ask one more, and then we can go back and forth on it. And this is your specific interest in Galicia. That is, you have spent a considerable amount of time studying a Habsburg territory. You have shown us how important East Galicia played a role in the Wilsonian period. In a way, your entree to Ukraine has been what might be called through a Polish Western Ukrainian vector. When you look at Ukraine, and you have in your career frequently come into contact with Russian specialists who have paid relatively little attention, I would estimate or guess, to Ukraine entirely. How much do you think that shaped your understanding of Ukraine, and how much does it at the moment affect when you look at the Ukrainian situation that you were so deeply ingrained in this Galician context?
Great question. I've been interested in Galicia throughout my academic career. I should mention that my father's parents, my grandparents, were born in Galicia. They were born in Tarnów and just around Tarnów in west central Galicia. So I was aware of Galicia even as a child, heard it as a place mentioned by my grandparents, who I would say my grandfather particularly would have identified himself as a Jewish Galician, as a Galicianer, as one of the pieces in his identity kit. And it was a sense of identity that was meaningful and important to him. So I would say, first of all, about Galicia, that it's always been fascinating to me as a complex problem of identity related to, coming back to the map again, a place that didn't exist on the map when I was a child, in my Cold War childhood, right? It had simply vanished from the map, but I was aware of it having a historical existence before I even began to study history. I would say that for me, coming to Ukrainian history from a Galician perspective, and I think that that would be true not just for me and in relation to my grandparents, but for me in relation to my professors as well, means that for me it's always very clear, right, that Ukraine does not inevitably belong to some Russian sphere or Russian world, right? Galicia, of course, is the piece of Ukraine that does not have a long historical connection to Russia. Its relations are to Vienna and then to Warsaw, and those are problematic and interesting, those relations, but they clearly remove it from the world of Russian studies. And I think that people in the academic world who come to Ukraine from that angle, from the West, that is to say, through Western Ukraine, probably understand Ukrainian history a little bit differently than people who come at it from an Eastern angle. What's your sense of that, Frank? How would you? I mean, you also come to it from the Western vector. Do you think that it shapes a different perspective on Ukrainian history? I would be tempted to say yes.
Yeah, it amazingly so. And what I think bringing closer to current affairs, in times dangerously so on the regionalization, that is in the last 30 years, the paradigm of West and East of dividing Ukraine became very deeply ingrained. Galicia somewhat expanded into a wider range. And therefore, I think caused some of us, and I would say myself as well, to maybe miss things that were changing in identities in Ukraine as a new civic identity took over in much of Ukraine and involved, and of course, the concentration on language, which was so essential to anyone working in the Habsburg world, and language being overwhelmingly the point that one struggled, maybe made me others miss some of these things. So that would be my own observation, but certainly when we now see the attempt to negate any sort of Ukrainian separate entity. The only other thing I would say on my own, and then I'll pass on to a colleague to ask a question, is that the great importance, of course, I studied of the Cossack Hetmanate and the central areas, which becomes the major ideology of Galicia as well, of the Ruthenians of Galicia, it dominates. So it's not the West that gives most of the core of Ukrainian thought, but the central and eastern Ukraine. And with that, maybe I'd like to ask Martin Schutzer-Wessel, I see he has a hand up with perhaps to enter into our discussion.
Thank you very much, Larry, for this super interesting talk and for your discussion with Frank. I have one question about Wilson and Masaryk. I mean, you made clear that Wilson had not much knowledge about Ukraine and maybe even not much interest. But as you underline in your book, there's an intense friendship with Masaryk, and Masaryk had excellent knowledge about Russia and Ukraine. And wasn't there any transfer of knowledge between Masaryk and Wilson with regard to Ukraine? And wasn't there any interest in the case of Wilson with regard to Ukraine, maybe not in national terms, but in fighting Soviet ideology and Soviet power?
So, it's a great question. And I have not uncovered discussions between Masaryk and Wilson that touch on Ukraine. And my sense is, from the discussions that I have followed between them, is that Masaryk, like Paderewski, uses this friendship in a very focused way. That is to say, Masaryk and Wilson genuinely like each other, right? They are academics of a certain, common feather. But Masaryk is very aware that the ways in which he informs Wilson will shape Wilson's agenda, and Masaryk very much wants that agenda to be focused on Czechoslovakia. So I don't think that he's bothering Wilson with expansive backgrounds about Eastern Europe. I think he's more keen to keep Wilson focused on topic. As far as Wilson's attitude towards the Bolshevik Revolution, he's very hostile to the Bolshevik Revolution. Although, interestingly, Wilson is also hostile to the Tsarist Empire, right? He doesn't, he's allergic to both of those forms of Russian government. My work on Wilson suggests to me that Wilson learns his hostility to empire from thinking about the Ottoman Empire, transfers that hostility to the Habsburg Empire over the course of the war, and would have been very capable of transferring that hostility fully to the Russian Empire and thinking analytically about the different peoples who made up the Russian Empire as candidates for his idea of national self-determination. He never gets there, right? But I mean, again, for Wilson, the whole period of time in which he's involved in this is very brief, right? It dates from 1917, when he first contemplates becoming involved in the war, when everybody's thinking about Russia is completely transformed as well by the Bolshevik Revolution and is rendered very uncertain, right? To the moment when the treaties fail in 1919 and 1920, Wilson also collapses, has a stroke. We're talking about at most a 3-year period in which Wilson's ideas about this region evolve and develop. He's aware of, in a small way, of Ukraine as being part of what he understands to be larger problem of Russian Empire and then Bolshevism, but not actually ready to, at any point during those 3 years, to extend his thinking about national self-determination, to thinking comprehensively about the Russian Empire. Lenin, of course, is, although on rather different terms.
Thank you.
And maybe on, you've done a lot of work on conceptualization from Eastern Europe in the age of the Enlightenment through the conceptualization of Galicia, and then now this conceptualization of how we're going to redo Eastern Europe after World War I. What do you think you've found out now with the study you've done now that would have helped you in writing about the Enlightenment and Eastern Europe? Or did this at all change your views on the ideas of Galicia, on the works you've done? That is, how much do you see continuity in building in the works that you've done? And how much does this new book in some way change what you have seen as, after all, what often was the result of wars, forcing a rethinking and changing of maps? And if you want to, we'd encourage you to go on and to think into what we're facing at the moment, that is although we're in the midst of the war, of how much this brings about a rethinking.
So what I would say about that, Frank, if I were to look back across several projects, one of the things that would be clearer to me as a historian would be that different periods crystallize geopolitical issues in different ways based on pretty highly contingent circumstances. I mean, when I wrote about the idea of Eastern Europe in the 18th century, I was writing about it from a late Cold War perspective, right? As the Cold War was ending, and using my understanding of Eastern Europe as a child of the Cold War as a little bit of a lever for trying to pull apart the idea of Eastern Europe in the 18th century. That was, for me, analytically, a little bit of a lucky coincidence in the way in which my lifetime intersected with these particular issues. But if I were, if I were going to review that work, I would want to be aware that these issues don't just develop in a consistent way, but are constantly refashioned and crystallized in very different ways depending upon the geopolitical affairs of the moment. War, for sure, a crystallizing factor, even for Voltaire, right? It's looking back to the Great Northern War of Charles XII that he's able to put together pieces of Eastern Europe in a way that makes sense to him. 19th century, I think, would raise a whole different set of issues for thinking about Eastern Europe. One of the things that would interest me would be to try to, I've never done this, to refocalize thinking about Eastern Europe around the Crimean War, which I think is an interesting moment, and one that's interesting for, the current moment as well. So what I think that looking at the current war, I think that it's clear that it is, to me at least, it's not proving academic things that we've shown along, but it's showing us, our academic problems in new lights and in new ways, and bringing them to a broader public in new lights and new ways. I think that, if we were to say, go back just the 50 years to the founding of the Ukrainian Institute at Harvard in the 1970s. There would be some aspects of this struggle that I think that would have made sense to us in the 1970s from the heart of the Cold War, sitting at 1583 Mass Ave and thinking about Ukraine in relation to Moscow. But I think there are other aspects that, would probably be, baffling from the perspectives of the 1970s, and that would be, harder to understand from a simple Cold War perspective. And I mean, this is, I don't know whether this is a fruitful way for us to pursue, but I would, I tend to think that each historical moment reshapes the way we understand particular issues, reshapes the way we understand, in this case, Ukraine, principle of nationality in Ukraine, sense of civic nationhood in Ukraine, relation of Ukraine to Russia, long history of Russian Empire. All of these are pieces that we've discussed separately, but that reform in different ways as we look at them in the present tragic circumstances.
And then before we open up generally to, and I urge our listeners to please ask questions in the chat, which will be read so you can take part more actively in the discussion. One of the interesting parts of your career has been the study of religion, and particularly what some would call almost a, if not apologetic, at least a revindication of the position of the Uniate Church of the 18th century. We now suddenly see religion emerging in this war, I think almost to the shock of parts of the world, as a extremely important component. How much, when you look at your beginning with the studying of the nunciatures, the relationship of church at the time of the Polish partitions, I think prepares you for the various other projects you were on, and even your observations of the current situation and current war.
So what I would say about my religious background here is, I mean, the issues of Uniate Greek Catholic Church come up for me for the first time in the Vatican archive in the early 1980s. And if you look at it from the perspective of the Vatican archive, the Uniate Greek Catholic Church is super important and looms very large for the Vatican when they are thinking about the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. It was also something that was impressed upon me as something important by Professor Pritsak in the 1980s, in the period leading up to the millennium of Christianity in Rus Ukraine. It was something he especially wanted me to pay attention to and think about and write about. And my work on that subject was, very much inspired by and guided by him. What I found most interesting in the research that I did on the Greek Catholic Church was its what seemed to me its remarkable viability in the late 18th century. That is to say, something that a church that's created very largely by the episcopate from above, right, based on a very delicate compromise among faiths that would be very easy to imagine coming apart. What interested me was that by the end of the 18th century, it was viable in the sense that it was meaningful to people at the parish level, that, that their Greek Catholic faith was something that helped them to understood who they were in the religious world. It was, something extraordinary when Greek Catholicism showed its viability again in the late 20th century, came back to life, right, in the late 20th century following the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And if I were thinking about it in relation to the current war, I would, want to think about the different ways in which identities remain viable and powerful, more powerful than you would predict. And in this case, not just the religious identity, right, if we were thinking about the current crisis, but the ability to transcend that religious identity and connect it with broader social and political senses of civic nationhood, right? The other side of this, which we haven't really talked about yet, but would be really interesting to talk about, is the really ugly and cynical way that Putin has used ideas about religion and nationality in order to pursue his project of Russian aggression. And it's meant that religion has been a rather fraught subject in the current war, but fraught in a way that I think has ultimately consolidated a sense of civic identity among Ukrainians, notwithstanding the very cynical manipulation of these issues that Putin has attempted to perpetrate from Moscow.
And maybe I could ask Lena, who has kindly agreed to read some of our questions coming on the chat, and I encourage others to please add questions to it, and then we can continue our conversation as well. And we by all means would like Larry, you to also comment on what you would like to comment on before we conclude our session. But Lena, if you perhaps you can deal with the questions.
Yes, we have several questions about Wilson's principle of national self-determination. One question is from Kai Struve. Wilson's principle of national self-determination was based on an ethnic national identity. Was there some reflection of Wilson or his advisors on the fact that this was something very different from what the US were built on? And another question from David Borchin: how did Woodrow Wilson define self-determination? Was his understanding of the concept not more characterized as the exercise of political power within the state for political rights, going insofar as to support autonomy, which in Eastern Europe was deliberately modified to instead focus on striving for national independence, like Poland, Czechoslovakia, Ukraine, Hungary, or unification, like Romania, Yugoslavia?
Let me think where to jump in there. So I think Wilson is aware of correspondences between Eastern Europe and the United States. That is to say, almost every one of the groups that is pursuing a national agenda in Eastern Europe in the early 20th century has some immigrant constituency in the United States in the early 20th century. Wilson is not particularly comfortable with immigrant ethnic politics in the United States. He himself is a Protestant patrician from Virginia, but it's something that he has to come to terms with the idea that in a voting democracy, people will have different kinds of agendas. I would say that for Wilson, while the unifying factor for him would have been the democratic basis of national self-determination, whether in the United States or in Eastern Europe, for him, right, American politics was about transcending ethnic differences to create a civic polity that could involve and include what were then still quite new immigrant national groups whereas his approach to Eastern Europe was analytic. That is to say, he believed that you could map different nationalities into different spaces, and that you could imagine them occupying different political territories, whether autonomous or independent. As I suggested to you in the original 14 points, Wilson is focused on national autonomy rather than national independence. Interest, and it's really the contingent circumstances of the war that push him rather reluctantly from ideas about autonomy within larger federated structures to ideas of absolute national independence, especially in the case of Austria-Hungary, right? He doesn't actually fully endorse the dissolution of Austria-Hungary until October of 1918, when the war is basically over in October of 1918. So it's something he comes to very slowly. For him, there are two counterparts to national independence in Eastern Europe. One is what he gradually comes to realize as the importance of minority rights, as he comes to appreciate that it's not fully possible to produce homogeneous mappings of ethnicity onto territorial space. And I suggested that a little bit in the PowerPoint. It's something that is very thorny and complicated for him, and something that he worries about a lot in the later stages of the peace conference, and especially in relation to Poland. The other, of course, is the League of Nations and the idea of a transnational organization that will incorporate the diverse national states into some kind of federated structure that would provide a wholeness to their, many differential identities and political forms. So it's something that he learns a little bit about with reference to American politics, but fundamentally understands the structure of multinational Europe to be something different from American federalism as he moves into the later stages of the peace conference. Frank, you have thoughts about how you about that, as well?
I would just add one thing, and this also affects personally and since it's brought up, and I wonder whether it's come part in the discussion of your book. I was a graduate of the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs at Princeton, which no longer exists because the name of Woodrow Wilson has had to be removed by Princeton University from the name of that school. I think it's somewhat of interest to our listeners in Ukraine as the U.S. has had to deal and change its heroes and change its monuments. Have any of the response to your book also involve this new Woodrow Wilson? That is, Woodrow Wilson has changed remarkably in the past decade as to where he stands in general estimation of the American public and academia as well. Does that affect the way that your book is looked at and his views on Eastern Europe?
So let me say two things about that. First of all, it's an interesting irony that at the very moment that Wilson's statues are going up again in Eastern Europe, 2011 at the Prague train station, the statue is put up again, the statue that was taken down by Hitler in 1939. That's exactly the moment when Wilson is falling in estimation in America beginning at Princeton, but more generally in discussions of American history. And that's a kind of interesting crossing of reputations, the rediscovery of Wilson in Eastern Europe at the moment that Wilson is really being questioned as a liberal thinker and political figure in American history. Here's what I would say about that most specifically, and I'm willing to go a little bit out on a limb here. Wilson's great failing as a political figure in the United States is connected to his the fact that he really does believe in segregation. He believes, and you know, the worst thing that his administration does is it resegregates the American Federal Civil Service following Reconstruction after the Civil War. It brings new segregation between blacks and whites into American life. So Wilson believes in a weird way, and this is consistent in both his American politics and his European politics, that people who are different have trouble living together. And it's partly the principle of national self-determination as well. And I should say to you that when Wilson refers to nations in Eastern Europe, he very often refers to them as races, different races. It's a very common confusing slippage of usage in the early 20th century in the English language, the ways in which the words race, people, nation, and ethnicity are used in a careless and interchangeable way and are not clearly defined one from another. And I think that in a strange way, we could say that the principle of segregation that Wilson subscribes to in American racial politics, which makes Wilson a reactionary figure even for his time, is connected to the sense of national difference, which is the foundation of his national self-determination ideology in Eastern Europe, and is part of what we consider his progressive legacy. That is to say, this particular aspect of Wilson, which is most regressive in American politics, is also part of his progressive legacy in Eastern Europe. And that's a hard thing it was a hard thing for me to wrap my head around. And I think that it requires further study and research, precisely connected to the ideas and the ways in which racial difference and national and ethnic difference were confused in the early 20th century.
Thank you.
Yes, we have a question from Hanna Kulahina-Stadenchenko. How relevant is it today to separate the history of Galicia from the history of Ukrainian statehood in general? The author of the question herself thinks that the emphasis on regionalization is not necessary today. For example, Central Ukraine had much influence on Galicia in terms of language. Historically, however, Galicia had more opportunity to preserve the Ukrainian language than Central and Eastern Ukraine. Currently, Ukraine is an integral state united by border and language. So what should be the balance between regionalization and integrity?
Gee, that's a great question. I think that probably the ideas of regional distinctness within Ukraine is something that will be preserved going forward. And one of the things that's interesting and important about Ukraine as a unified civic nation is that it preserves certain senses of historical, religious, and ethnographic difference across its many territories. I understand that at a moment of war, right, the crucial aspect is national unity, and that Ukraine is probably over the course of the last several months been forged as a unified civic nationhood more forcefully than ever before by the terrible circumstances. But if we dare to look beyond the war, right, I think that probably we would return to the idea that Ukraine is a complex country made up of multiple regions that have different traditions, as well as a common history, and that regionalism is one of the ways of respecting those differences. Anybody else on the panel? There's a lot of expertise on this panel. Martin, Slavka, Frank, would you want to comment on that? Issues of regionalism versus issues of civic unity?
Slavka.
I don't see those notions as it's mutually exclusive, but there is one interesting twist. We did a lot of surveys on regionalism in Ukraine, and there is a very interesting result that we have a lot of regionalism in Ukraine. We don't have regions. What we call our regions is actually very flexible, very unstable, and it is. But there is one exception, and the exception is Galicia. Galicia always stands out, but it doesn't stand out in terms of separation, but it stands as a kind of region being distinctly with a strong sense of regionalism, that's to say. But as I say again, it's not mutually exclusive.
Is it your sense that that sense of regionalism remains as powerful at the current moment as it's always been, or has it been transformed?
Very much so, because in most of the cases, even in the map of the electoral map, we see Galicia voting very distinctly from other regions. Not different, but distinctly. Intensity is much more stronger, so to say. Very much like most Ukrainians do, but much more intense, so to say. And most other interesting point, the same refers to Polish Galicia. It also stands very much, stands out from all other Polish regions. So actually, this is the point. This was been done some time ago by one of the Polish political geographer, that if you talk about this large region between Baltic Sea and Black Sea, there's probably only one real region, and the region is Austrian Galicia. Not Western, not Eastern Galicia, but Galicia per se. I mean, the very distinctive borders and very distinctive attitudes, both in the Polish and the Ukrainian case, which gives our idea that there's something about the Habsburg legacy, which make this region so very distinctive.
And the only thing I would add, I think we discover also regions in the course of this war. It's been interesting to see reactions in areas like Sumy, that I don't know how much study went on before, the degree of civic patriotism, unification on. I think our younger scholars in Ukraine were already studying this. I don't know if enough attention was being paid to it. Slavko, did you?
Yeah, this is another interesting point, that there's practically no big region, large region in central Ukraine. There is central Ukraine only. And we believe it could be explained, the hypothesis, that this is due to the factor of Kyiv. Kyiv is the largest city in this large region. Therefore, it somehow consumes all the regional identity. So there is no real distinct identities between, say, originally between Galicia and I would say probably Dnipro and Kherson, so to say. So there's another quite different entity which could hardly coin Galicia region. Historical memory, historical that exists, but not in terms of the different attitudes or some different patterns that could give this large entity as a real term of region, so to say. So what I'm saying, regionalism in Ukraine is very complicated phenomenon, but we don't see that any kind of the separatism in this regionalism. It's just that Ukraine is very much diverse, being at the same time very unified.
And Lena, would you have other questions?
One question from Ali Zahid. He asks you to elaborate a little bit on the language of enslavement used by Woodrow Wilson and before by George de Lacy Evans on the designs of Russia and the Testament of Peter the Great. And the question is, are these merely examples of Western-orientated geopolitical perspectives towards the East and the desire of Western thinkers to uphold Anglo-Saxon hegemony over the heartland, according to Halford Mackinder?
So I'm tempted to say it's a great question, a little of one and a little of the other. That is to say, there is an element of what we might call Orientalism in the attribution of slavery, right, to Eastern Europe. And you see it pretty clearly in the 18th century literature, in which serfdom in Eastern Europe is very often characterized as slavery. And indeed, it was very harsh. In the case of Wilson, he does in fact inherit some of that tradition, but remember that slavery has its own history in the United States, and slavery is something, you know, that exists in the United States right up into Wilson's own childhood, and I think that it would be wrong to see his use of the term as merely a matter of Orientalism, that is to say, attributing slavery to Eastern lands, and that we would have to see him working within an American historical legacy as well, in which he is both partly trying to reimagine himself as Lincoln, as a great emancipator, while at the same time perhaps obfuscating and confusing Lincoln's legacy of emancipation, which Wilson is partly undoing with the new segregationism of the early 20th century. So I would see the use of the term, which, by the way, with reference to the Habsburg monarchy, a preposterous hyperbole to refer to the peoples of the Habsburg monarchy as enslaved by the Habsburg king and emperor in Vienna. Habsburg monarchy, after all, was a constitutional monarchy with full male suffrage and a set of collective national rights enshrined by constitutional principle, which are far more extensive than anything that you would have found in other countries, either in Europe or in America. So, I mean, the idea that the Habsburg peoples were enslaved by their king and emperor is one that something that Masaryk might have suggested to Wilson, and Wilson might have easily borrowed from Masaryk, but I think would have to be understood as a purely a piece of rhetorical hyperbole in that regard. For Wilson, then, I would say, just to respond to this very thoughtful, very interesting question, it borrows a little bit from an older history of Orientalism and a little bit from his relation to his own complex relation to the American historical legacy with regard to slavery. Wilson is born in a slave state. He's born in Virginia.
And maybe as we're coming to an end, I'd give you a chance, Larry. Is there obviously many of our listeners are in Ukraine, carrying on academic positions at a time of war. Others are in Germany and trying to deal with the Ukrainian issue, which is affecting all of Europe. I wonder whether there's anything generally you would like to say about a country in this state of war and your observations as someone who pays attention to closely to what is going on on both sides of the pond at the moment?
I would say that, you know, the war that Ukrainians are very courageously fighting now, right, helps us to understand what it means to what it means to fight for national independence in a very powerful and concrete way. And I think that that's one of the reasons that it has brought forth so much solidarity from publics, from intellectuals across Europe and in America. I think it's been powerful and very moving. And I usually think about this a little bit, and if I were going to reference a conversation that I recently had with my father, who's 95, and is listening now. We recently had a conversation about the Spanish Civil War, which was very moving to him as a child. My father was born in 1927 and was, 9, 10, 11, and 12 at the time of the Spanish Civil War, and remembers being very stirred by the struggle of the Spanish Republic against the fascists. And it was a moment in which Spain came to represent what it meant to fight for freedom against dark odds and powerful, sinister forces. And it loomed very large for people who had not thought about Spain that way up until that moment in 1936, and were, not necessarily interested in Spain or Hispanophiles. There's a moment at which Spain in the late 1930s catalyzed a global sense of what it meant to fight in a meaningful way for freedom. And I think that right now that's Ukraine for all of us.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and thank you for the time. Thank you for all of the work you have done and all of the ways you have touched on Ukrainian history, but more generally by placing it in a much broader context of not only East Central Europe, but far beyond, for whatever, closing in on our transnational and global history. One thing I'd like to say is to all my colleagues in Ukraine who are at the moment carrying on teaching in very difficult circumstances, at least from my point of view, this shows it's a worthwhile endeavor. At least some of your students turn out to be Larry Wolffs. So it's worthwhile in those difficult terms for you to continue on. I also might point out that his next book will be called The Afterlives of Empresses, Fairy Tale Opera, Habsburg Catastrophe, and Post-Imperial Political Culture. And of course, what I am very curious about is whether Pani Cesareva Cesarskoho Rodu, the Empress Sisi, is going to appear in this or not. That will get a much wider, at least Galician and even beyond Galician public, I think, to pay attention to such a work. We look forward to that work. And I am sure many of you look forward to reading his work on Woodrow Wilson. I want to point out that our next session of Historians in the War and the Future will be on the 28th of July. It will deal on testimonies about the war in Ukraine, how to conduct interview-based research. Responding to the ever-expanding social trauma on a massive scale, researchers in oral history, ethnographers, and cultural anthropologists have actively begun to collect witness testimonies. This seminar will allow experts to exchange ideas on the following questions. What are the ethical consequences of a rapid response to the war? How should field research be conducted during a constantly increasing trauma? How to conduct interview-based research during war without inflicting damage on those with whom we are working. The speakers will be Natalia Kanenko-Friesen of the University of Alberta, Helenada Grinchenkov of the Karazin Kharkiv National University and of the Bergische Universität Wuppertal, Claudia Seymour of the Geneva Graduate Institute, and Hassan Hasanovich Srebrenica Potarachi Memorial Center. So that is on the 28th of July. I presume at a similar time, but it will be announced on our list. And once again, I would like to thank Professor Wolff for his wonderful PowerPoint presentation and his open discussion with us when we face so many problems of what the consequences of war will be and the outcome of war. So thank you very much for taking part in this session.
Thank you, Frank. It was wonderful for me to get to do this with you. It was really, very moving to me that we got to have this discussion together. Thank you also, Martin and Slavko. It's, great to be having this discussion with you all at this very challenging time.
Okay, and I thank Lena, and as well we thank our translator and Maria, and as well our translator Pavlo Hrycak, who made it possible for Ukrainian listeners to take part in it. Thank you very much.